Good morning, everybody from downtown Maitland. It's Judy Brown and Derek from Governance Junction today. We're up to our fifth part of our series. And today we're looking at the best interests of the members and good governance basics. I'd like to hand it over to Derek.
Good morning, everyone. Just sharing my screen here. How's everyone? I hope everyone's well. And thanks for joining us on what is our fourth in this series of short webinars to hopefully help not-for-profit boards understand some basic principles. Obviously, all the topics that we talk about here are, a lot more detail than we can cover in just 30-odd minutes. But we're hoping that what we're doing here is helping lift the understanding and the education around corporate governance, because what we always say is that being on a board, not-for-profit board, the wonderful people who volunteer, it is a profession, it's not a hobby. And with it comes a lot of responsibilities and a lot of work to do. So as Judy said today, we are looking at what are the basic principles of not-for-profit governance. And as I said, this is the fourth in our series. Why are we just talking about some basics at this point in time? Well, in future webinars, we're going to talk about some of the more legalities of being on a board. But what I've found from our experience and Judy's experience is that for many, we either forget what it is to be on a board, and we forget this thing called the fiduciary relationship. We forget what that's about, and sometimes we need to be reminded about how it works. And for others, many who are on the board, as I said, they're wonderful volunteers. They come onto the board, but for many, they're not experienced in this and don't have that experience or knowledge in corporate governance. And for them, understanding the basics, and we're going to talk today, we're going to go back in time and look at the history of corporate governance to try and understand why is it that we do the things we do, and what are the core responsibilities, not the detailed responsibilities. We're going to talk about those in a few weeks, but what are the core responsibilities about being on a board? So as always with our webinars, we talk in questions. We pose questions that we've heard from our clients time and time again. And we propose to answer those questions. So who invented corporate governance? Well, we can go back to the year 1600. And it was actually Queen Elizabeth I. She granted to the East India Trading Company. The East India Trading Company was this, what we would call a global corporate entity at the time, trading around the world, based out of the UK, and she granted a charter to them. And the East India Trading Company is quite important in this story, because it's the first, if you like, corporation, the first true business where the concept of a shareholder came about. So a shareholder being that individuals could own a bit of this company. So everyone could pay a little bit of money and own a piece of the East India Trading Company. And in fact, originally the charter was granted to 218, at the time were called members, but they are actually shareholders. So 218 people owned a piece of the East India Trading Company. They found fairly quickly, though, that having 218 people as owners of this company attempt to manage it was unruly, was quite difficult. And so they very quickly formed a small group of that 218, which was called the Court of Directors. And that small group was delegated with the responsibility of managing the East India Trading Company. And that small group was the first ever board. Okay. Years later, eventually, for that small group being such a a wide organization spread across the globe, at the known globe at the time, the known world at the time, they realized then that underneath the board we needed managers, and then managers are a relatively new concept. In fact, management as a profession came about a couple of hundred years later with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution. But initially we had the shareholders, 218, and who delegated their responsibility to manage the East India Trading Company to this group that were called the Court of Directors. And with this was born what is known as the fiduciary relationship. And we're going to talk about that in detail in a moment. But then the next question obviously is, not-for-profits don't have shareholders. You can't own a not-for-profit. We talked about, I think, that about in our very first webinar. We said, the difference between not-for-profits and commercial businesses is that they're not owned. There's no shareholders. You don't deliver a return to shareholders. Instead, we have members. So, shareholders versus members. In a not-for-profit organization, the equivalent of shareholders are what we call members. And in a governance, when we talk about the principles of corporate governance in a not-for-profit, the members are the equivalent of the shareholders. So the board is responsible to the members for a number of things, but they're responsible for managing on behalf of the members the not-for-profit entity, whether in modern terms, whether that's a company limited by guarantee or whether that is an association. Okay, so when we talk shareholders in this discussion, the equivalent not-for-profit in a governance perspective is the members. But a lot has happened since 1600. A lot has happened since the East India Trading Company. It's a very interesting story if you ever follow it. But the concept of corporate governance evolved and it grew. And a lot of what we have today in the basis of the Corporations Act and the basis of the fundamentals of corporate governance came from this evolution from 1600 to about 1896, when Lord Linley, who was a barrister at the time, an expert at the time, you would say an expert in corporate law at the time, with the famous case of Salomon versus Salomon, came through the concept of common law, came what we now know today as the fundamentals of corporate governance, the concept that we've talked about before of a corporate personality. So that is where a company or an association, incorporated association, we talked about incorporations a few weeks ago, has its own personality. Under law, that company, not the directors, not the members, not the managers, is seen as a separate legal entity, a separate personality. And that provides the benefit of legal separation between those groups. It means that the company can enter into contracts, the company can borrow money, the company can be sued, as opposed necessarily to, in particular, the members. So it separates that. So there's a level of separation, legal separation, which provides many advantages. And if I go back to our very first webinar, we recommended quite strongly for those looking at embarking on a new not-for-profit to strongly not consider an unincorporated association as an option for structure because of this reason, because you have this under law, this corporate personality, this recognized as a quasi-person, a company or an association, incorporated association. They also exist forever. They exist and they survive directors, they survive boards, they survive members, they survive managers. They exist until somebody chooses to close them down, to wind them up. And there's also limited liabilities. In other words, that by being a member of a not-for-profit, your liability is limited to what is denoted in the Constitution, sometimes usually around $10. So then if the organisation does have to be wound up, then individual members are only liable for the liabilities for what is owed by that business to the tune of that amount. Okay. So these concepts were born in 1896, and from 1896, from a fairly major court case under common law, came what we know today. It has largely remained unchanged since 1896, and sure, you know, every time we turn around, ASIC is putting more and more load on those that are on boards under the Corporations Act to respond to the modern world that we live in today. But the basic principles of corporate governance have evolved from this point in 1896. Today, not-for-profit boards must act in the best interest of the organisation as a whole. This is the concept around this fiduciary relationship. The members have delegated and handed the responsibility of looking after the organisation to the board. And so those boards have to at all times act in the best interest of the organisation. And we think, yeah, okay. But then when we walk into a boardroom, we sit at a board meeting, we're really acting in the best interest of the organisation. We're not acting in the best interest of ourselves or a related party to ourselves. Are we making decisions and having discussions that are the interest in the organisation? And that is a key fundamental question we have to ask ourselves time and time again. Boards are also charged with overseeing the performance of the organisation. You know, the financial performance. We've talked about not-for-profits. Doesn't mean you're allowed to necessarily make a loss. Doesn't mean that you can't make a profit as a not-for-profit. We've discussed this before in a previous webinar. In fact, not-for-profits should make a profit because that surplus is reinvested into the organisation so that it can do work on its social purpose, deliver on its social purpose for years to come. Okay. At all times, the board has to make sure that it is meeting the expectation of the members. This is via the Constitution and via the annual general meetings and other mechanisms that different organisations have in terms of having the members' expectations presented to the board. They also have to manage risk and compliance. In other words, they have to comply with the law, and we're going to talk about that in a few weeks, about what those duties are to comply with those things. People on boards must bring an independent perspective and judgment to their decision making. So they're there as individuals, but boards make decisions. Individuals are held accountable for those decisions, but it is the board as a collective that makes it. And so we're looking for those on boards to have an independent, another point of view. And it's very important when you're on a board to speak up, to not sit back. It's quite a risky position to be on the board and sit back and say nothing and go with the flow. And you're going to hear that from us in the next few webinars. Do not go with the flow. Speak up. Those on boards today also provide a diverse set of skills, expertise, and experience. And, webinar further down the track, we'll talk about the makeup of boards and how we achieve that. They're also there to support the CEO or the management team, whether you have a CEO or you have a general manager, whatever you call the senior person that's responsible for managing the business. They're there to support, guide, provide resources to them, but also hold them accountable for that performance. So what is this fiduciary relationship? What do we really mean by that? Well, as a definition, the fiduciary relationship is where a person has undertaken to act in the best interest of another and not in her or his own interests. And again, we as with a recent not-for-profit and looked at their agendas of their board meetings and their various supporting policy documents and things, and they just really, for example, they didn't have on that agenda the opportunity for directors to declare a conflict of interest. And it's these things that remind us of our responsibility to act in the best interest of the organisation and not of ourselves or anybody else. And if you're on two boards, if you're on multiple boards, etc., sometimes there can be that conflict of duty in terms of who you're actually acting for when you're sitting in a meeting and you're there as a director of that particular organisation. The fiduciary relationship represents the legal relationship between the director and the company. And the director, the relationships between the individual, even though it's the board that makes the decision as a collective, the legal relationship is between the individual director that's on the board and the company. It has that duty to act with fidelity and trust. So, fidelity and trust means that, you have to respect confidentiality. You have to, not disparage the organisation that you're a director of. There's all those sorts of things that fit into that. We're going to talk about that in much more detail, in a few weeks' time. You have the obligation of undivided loyalty. And I'm reading this off the screen because these are very important words. Undivided loyalty. Okay. There's no grey area with this. But in reality, when we go into the boardroom and we're sitting there, it is grey. Our responsibilities are black and white, but the reality is grey. And at times we have to question ourselves, and sometimes that gets tested. The fiduciary relationship obliges directors to act honestly, in good faith, and to the best of their ability in the interests of the company. And we understand stuff happens. We understand things happen, and we understand directors cannot predict the future, and the directors have varying abilities sitting on those boards. That is understood. But it is important at all times to act in your best ability with regard to acting in the interest of the company. This all comes from common law. It all comes back from Lord Lindley in 1896. It all comes back to that. And it applies whether you're on a company limited by guarantee, whether you're on association, it doesn't matter. These apply equally. And again, a bit of a myth with being on a not-for-profit board is that because I'm on a not-for-profit board, this stuff doesn't apply. That is not true. It most certainly does. Your personal interest, personal advantage cannot override the interests of the company. And so this fiduciary relationship, I've spent a bit of time on this page, and these words that are here are very important because this is the core of what it means for how corporate governance works. It is where our duties and responsibilities and being on a board derive. It's where things like the Corporations Act and the AC&C standards of governance, those types of things, it's where they all derive from this fiduciary relationship. But I get confused about my role. And in not-for-profits, this is a very common question. Why is that? Because sometimes when we're on a not-for-profit board, sometimes we wear two hats. Sometimes we wear three hats. Sometimes we're on a board as an executive committee member or a director, but we're also a member. Some boards require you to join as a member to be on the board. Sometimes the directors are derived from members. And sometimes, particularly when we're starting out with a not-for-profit, we're also involved in the operation. We're also involved in management. And so, of course, sometimes we get confused about what our role is. But because we wear multiple hats, I'll say that, let's say it that way, because we're wearing different hats, doesn't change these relationships, doesn't change the fiduciary relationship, doesn't change these duties and responsibilities. What I say to people when they are operating with multiple hats is when you're making a decision. And this is what it's all about, is decision making. Think about, am I making this decision as part of the board, or am I making this decision as a manager? And again, at some point, we'll talk about the delegations of authority, you know, that document that should exist in all not-for-profits that defines who can make what sorts of decisions to what limits, whether it's the board, whether it's management, whether it needs to go back to members, etc. That becomes a key document for making that crystal clear for us, okay? But the members have appointed the board to govern as per the Constitution. That's the legal document. That's our next webinar about the Constitution. The board then has all the power to act, and it can, and usually does, delegate some or most of its responsibilities then to a manager, somebody called the CEO or somebody called the general manager, whatever you may call it, to then actually work the business, to then operate the business. Okay, so the key takeaway from this is think about, when I'm making this decision, when I'm involved in this particular meeting or this particular activity, if I'm wearing multiple hats, what's my role at this particular point in time? Think about that, and then think about then your fiduciary responsibilities. Who sets the standards for corporate governance and not-for-profits? I thought this would be a good point to raise this, because there are a number of organisations out there and regulators out there in Australia wanting to set the standards for corporate governance. The tax office has a great set of standards for corporate governance. Obviously, the ASIC under the Corporations Act does. But probably the one that is most applicable to us in the land of not-for-profits is the ACNC. And they have 5 standards, governance standards for charities and not-for-profits. And they're very, very quickly, they are that one, you must be a for-purpose organisation. You can't deliver return to members. You are there for a purpose, a charitable purpose, which we've talked about before. We must be accountable to members, and sometimes on boards we forget, and sometimes in management we forget that ultimately we are all accountable back to the members. And we forget that sometimes. We must comply with the laws in Australia. That's a bit of a no-brainer. The ACNC also wants us to make sure that the people that are on boards are suitable and responsible people. In fact, we have to make that declaration to them on a regular basis. And then finally, number 5, there are the duties of those people. And we must take reasonable steps to ensure that people that are on boards not only carry out their duties, but understand those duties. And I think at the end of the day, our series of webinars here and everything that Judy and I do in Corporate Governance Junction is about trying to educate people, trying to assist not-for-profits to make that understanding and help them improve that level of corporate governance. So directors in not-for-profits, you know, they're often not paid. They're wonderful people who volunteer. If they do get paid, it's usually a nominal amount. It's not like in the corporate world where if I'm a director of Westpac, I might get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. My duties and responsibilities on a not-for-profit board are no different to those of a director on Westpac, no different at all. And yet, when I'm a not-for-profit, I'm a volunteer. I not only do it for nothing, I also give up a lot of time, because being on a board takes a lot of time, takes a lot of work. If I'm going to do it properly, I might be paid for my expenses to attend. I might get paid just a nominal amount, a small amount of money. But it's certainly, there is quite a big difference between not-for-profit directors and commercial companies. But unfortunately, they are the duties and responsibilities under law are equally applicable. And I have had this I I've seen the look on some not-for-profit board members' faces when I emphasize this point to them. There's some of them have been on these boards for decades and not realized this. They've thought that because they're a volunteer, because they're not paid, then they're okay. And I can say here today, folks, that is just not the case. These are equally applicable. These duties, responsibilities, the fiduciary relationship, the concept of corporate governance is equally applicable, regardless of whether you are paid or whether you are not. An important point, boards have the power to act. Directors don't have the power to act as individuals. Okay, so it's boards make decisions. Directors are not empowered under the Constitution, under the fiduciary relationship, under the Corporations Act to act as individuals. Boards act. Boards act as a group. Okay, and group dynamics and teamwork, they're all things that perhaps we can talk about in weeks to come. But then there's a big but. Duties and responsibilities and liabilities are on the individual. So the boards make decisions, but if those decisions get challenged, in the worst case, in a court of law, then it's on the individual. Okay, and you will be questioned about the decisions you make, the questions you asked, the amount of inquiry and due diligence you took as an individual when a particular decision that may be under question was made. Okay, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. This, you don't have the power to act as an individual, but you are held accountable as individual. What's important here then, and we're going to say this for the next few webinars time and time again, is speak up, ask questions, don't ignore the board papers, read your board papers, gain an appreciation of the financial position of the organisation, of what the organisation does. How does that affect things like workplace health and safety? You have to get involved. You have to make that effort to understand, make your own inquiries, and above all, speak up, ask questions. So in summary, we need at times to remind ourselves of this fiduciary relationship. We forget that sitting in the background when it's the cut and thrust of doing business, when we're in board meetings and we're making big decisions and we're in management and we're doing things and we're hiring and we're firing and we're spending money and we're retrieving money and we're stamping things and we're doing all sorts of stuff and we're serving our customers, we're delivering on our purpose. We forget sometimes that sitting in the background are the members, and that the members have entrusted us as the board to look after this organisation, to deliver on its purpose and, operate it correctly within the bounds of the law and at all times in the best interest of the organisation. We forget that. Or sometimes, for many people on not-for-profit boards, we don't fully understand that. And that's the purpose of what we've been banging on about today. It is important to understand those duties and responsibilities. And if you're not sure, I would encourage you to click on and watch our next series of webinars, because that's where we're heading. We're going to talk about those in as much detail as we can in 30 to 45 minutes. If you're unsure, it is the ACNC that will remind you of what your standards of governance are. And it's always good in your constitutions and your board charters to reinforce that you as a board are working towards those standards of governance as a not-for-profit. And be clear on your role. If you are, and like many of your not-for-profits, you are wearing multiple hats as a member, as a board member, as a manager, think about what I'm doing now, the decision I'm making now, the meeting I'm at now. What's my role? Am I here as a director, sitting in a board meeting as a director, or am I here doing operational stuff? What is my role? and what is my limit of authority, and how does that fed into my duties and responsibilities? Okay. So there ends the lesson for everybody. And Judy, have we got any questions?
Mainly sort of comments. I mean, let's face it, the East India Trading Company can be used as an example of what not to do, because it was such a clear starting point.
Yeah.
From that point of view. And also, to me, when you're on a board and you're disagreeing with a concept or a decision to be made, you need to be really, really careful to say, am I disagreeing with this because I genuinely feel it's a bad idea for my organization? Or am I disagreeing with this because I don't particularly like the person saying it? Because I find that relationship thing, and I know we'll go into that on another webinar. I think it's really important that when you're about to say yes or no, am I agreeing with this or disagreeing with this for all of the right reasons?
It's such an important point, Judy, because when we say conflict of interest, it isn't just simply financial. It isn't just simply, the fact that, I might be approving a contract between a company where I'm a shareholder in that company, or my family member is a shareholder in that company. It's not as obvious as that, but it goes to exactly that point. Am I sitting in here in a board meeting, wasting the board's time, or blocking a decision or pushing a decision through because of my own career? Am I trying to present to the rest of the board that I'm such a good director and I've got all these experiences? Is it about my ego and my status? And that's why when we look at, am I truly acting in the best interest of the organization? Am I digging deep there? Am I truly, am I speaking up here or not for the best interest of the company, or for my own ego, for my own status, for my own personal agenda that I may have? Am I on this board to develop a political career, or to develop simply a career as a career director, and those are less tangible than the obvious conflicts of interest. And we'll talk about conflicts of interest because I think they are largely misunderstood. They're not bad things. What is bad is the way generally boards handle those. And but that's a really good point,
Yeah, it's definitely the non-disclosure, I think, of conflicts of interest is more the issue than the actual conflict of interest, because generally when it's brought to the forefront, it can be handled or delegated in a way that it negates all the risk around it.
And
It's when people don't tell you, I think, is a big thing.
Yeah, and I think the important point there, and we'll emphasize this when we do the webinar on conflicts of interest, it's not up for you to determine whether you have one. It's up for the other directors who aren't conflicted to make that determination. So if in doubt, if you're sitting back and you're making your own judgment and you say, oh, I'm okay with that, I'm not going to declare it, then that's the wrong thinking. You've got to, it's best to speak up, put it on the table, and have that clarified, and most importantly, have that minuted as well.
Absolutely. It's the documentation. And a lot of people don't realize with documentation, it's better to have a raw copy of the documentation and the final copy. So if ever you have to go back and actually review it, because sometimes the final copy is only summarized and you don't get the full view of people's concerns or questions that were asked.
Yeah.
So a lot of people aren't aware of that, to keep both. So if anything does happen, we can see who actually interacted and who behaved with the best interest of the organisation at that frame.
Yeah, and that goes to minutes and minute taking again. Again, we can talk 30 minutes on minutes, and the different views out there, the legal view from lawyers on minutes versus the view from others on what minutes. And many say minutes should be seconds, and others want copious minutes to protect themselves. And so, but it all comes back to this fiduciary relationship in terms of, am I acting in the best interest? And we've really got to question ourselves every time we walk into that board meeting, every time a matter is before there. It's far more complex than it sounds. I think is what I'm trying to say.
I think a lot of people don't realise they need to keep themselves educated. When they receive the actual information for the next meeting, they need to actually read it before they attend the meeting, because at times you're in the middle of a meeting and someone's arguing a point and it suddenly dawns on you that they haven't actually read the document.
Oh, that is one of the worst behaviours of a director, is wasting the board's time because you haven't done the pre-reading, and that flies in the face of, you know, and there was a famous case, I won't mention the company, before the courts, where the directors said we didn't read the board papers because they were too copious.
Yeah.
And the judge said, well, the reason they're too copious, that's your fault, because it's up to the board to make sure that the papers are, you know, for them easy to read, or giving them the information they require, but not reading them because they're copious is no excuse. Guilty.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
you know, that's one of your responsibilities, but it's also a lack of respect, Judy. You come to a board meeting, you haven't read the papers, and you've got to waste the board's time while you come up to date. That is a lack of respect to the other directors on the board, and to the chair, and to the organisation, and perhaps to the manager as well, that has gone to the trouble of putting a proposal to the board and directors haven't read it. Incredible level of disrespect, as well as, you know, flying in the face of their duties. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, well, that's all the sort of commentary and the questions we have for today. That was actually surprisingly interesting. It's a very difficult subject to put forward without putting us all to sleep. So yeah, I think this is a great one, and I think people should watch this at least twice.
Yeah, no, look, we've got to remind ourselves, I think, of what are we here for and why we do the things we do, and we forget at times about these things, and it serves as a good reminder for us all to say, hang on a minute, we're going down the wrong path here.
Absolutely.
Good thing. So our next webinar, which will be coming soon, our next YouTube clip will be about the Constitution, which is, again, a document that is largely disregarded and misunderstood. So we're going to clear up some myths about that. And then, as we talked about in this one, we're going to get into these, you know, these duties and responsibilities. And we're going to get into, you know, conflicts of interest, you know, and what they are. We're going to talk about conflicts of duty and how to handle those things. So we're going to get into the next few ones. We're going to get into the legalities of being on a board. What truly are my responsibilities? And we might be a little bit shocked and surprised about what those are. So we look forward to everyone clicking on and watching these future webinars.
Excellent. Well, we will say goodbye for the day, and it is Friday today, so looking forward to the weekend.
Yeah, everyone enjoy.
Thanks kindly. Bye.
Bye.